The raging waters crashed against her body as Margaret Thompson clung desperately to a branch, her knuckles white with effort, her lungs burning for air. The spring flood of 1875 had come without warning, turning the peaceful Colorado River into a roaring monster that had already claimed her wagon and horse. As the branch began to crack, Margaret closed her eyes, certain her 22 years of life were about to end in these murky depths. Then she heard a shout cutting through the thunder of the water. Opening her eyes, she saw a man on horseback racing alongside the riverbank, his face set with determination as he urged his mount faster, keeping pace with her as the current swept her downstream. "Hold on," he called, his voice strong and clear despite the roar of the water. The branch snapped. Margaret screamed as she was plunged back into the churning current, her heavy skirts dragging her under. Water filled her nose and mouth as she fought to surface, each second stealing more of her strength. Suddenly, strong arms encircled her waist, pulling her upward. Breaking through to air, she gasped and coughed as the man held her firmly against his chest. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough with exertion as he maneuvered them toward the shore, his powerful legs fighting the current while one arm kept her securely against him. When they finally reached the muddy bank, he half carried, half dragged her onto solid ground. Margaret collapsed onto her hands and knees, coughing up river water, her entire body trembling. Her rescuer knelt beside her, one hand steady on her back. "Breathe," he encouraged, his voice gentler now. "Just breathe." As her coughing subsided, Margaret looked up at the man who had saved her life. Water dripped from his dark hair, plastered to his forehead beneath a sodden cowboy hat. His eyes, a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin, studied her with concern. A day's growth of beard shadowed his jaw, and his clothes, a typical cowboy's attire of denim, cotton, and leather, were soaked through. "Thank you," she managed, her voice raw. "I thought I was going to die." He helped her to sit up, his hands steady and strong. "Name's Jackson Miller," he said. "Most folks just call me Jack." "Margaret Thompson," she replied, pushing her drenched auburn hair from her face. "I was heading to Silver Creek to meet my uncle when the flood caught me." Jack nodded, his eyes sweeping over the river that had almost claimed her life. "Lost your wagon?" "Everything," she confirmed, despair washing over her. "My horse, my supplies, all my belongings." A peculiar expression crossed Jack's face, then something like recognition followed by determination. He stood suddenly, pulling her to her feet beside him. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice taking on an unexpected intensity as his fingers tightened around hers. "I know this will sound strange coming from a stranger, but I swear on my life, I'm not letting go again." Margaret stared at him, confused by both his words and the fierce emotion behind them. "I don't understand. We've never met before." A small, sad smile touched his lips. "No, I suppose we haven't, not in the way you'd remember." Before she could question him further, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders appeared, slowing their mounts as they spotted Jack and Margaret on the riverbank. "Miller," called the lead rider, a gruff-looking man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. "Been looking for you. Saw the flood take out a wagon upstream. Guess you found the passenger." Jack nodded, keeping one hand firmly on Margaret's arm as if afraid she might be swept away again. "Sheriff Daniels, this is Miss Thompson. She's lost everything in the flood." The sheriff removed his hat, revealing a shock of gray hair. "Madam, sorry for your trouble. Where you headed?" "Silver Creek," Margaret replied, shivering as the wind cut through her wet clothes. "My uncle, Henry Thompson, has a shop there." "Thompson's Mercantile?" the sheriff asked, and when Margaret nodded, he continued, "That's a 2-day ride from here and in your condition." He looked at Jack. "Miller's ranch is closest, Might be best if he gets you somewhere warm before night falls. Jack nodded. I was thinking the same. He turned to Margaret. My place is about an hour's ride from here. You can rest, get some dry clothes, and I'll take you to Silver Creek when you're recovered. Margaret hesitated. The proper thing would be to decline. An unmarried woman did not simply go off alone with a man she'd just met, even one who had saved her life. But she had no money, no supplies, and night was approaching. The thought of spending it in wet clothes with no shelter was unthinkable. That's very kind of you, Mr. Miller, she said finally. Jack, he corrected, that same peculiar intensity flashing in his eyes. Call me Jack. As the sheriff and his deputies rode on, Jack led Margaret to his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that had somehow managed to stay close during the rescue. He helped her mount before swinging up behind her, his arms encircling her as he took the reins. Hold on, he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. As they rode away from the river, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Jack wasn't telling her, something about the way he'd looked at her, the strange words he'd spoken. I'm not letting go again, he'd said. As if he knew her, as if he'd lost her once before, but that was impossible. Margaret was certain she'd never met Jackson Miller in her life. The sun was beginning its descent when they reached Jack's ranch, a modest but well-maintained property nestled in a valley with mountains rising majestically in the distance. A main house of hewn logs stood proudly on a small rise, with a barn, corral, and several outbuildings scattered nearby. A stream, thankfully calm unlike the raging river they'd left behind, wound through the property. It's beautiful, Margaret said sincerely as Jack helped her dismount. It's home, he replied simply, but she caught the pride in his voice. An older man emerged from the barn, his weathered face breaking into a smile that quickly turned to concern when he saw their sodden state. Mr. Miller, what in tarnation happened to you? River flooded, Thomas, Jack explained, leading his horse forward. This is Miss Thompson. She lost her wagon and everything in it. She'll be staying with us until I can get her to Silver Creek. Thomas nodded respectfully to Margaret. Madam, let me take care of this fella while Mr. Miller gets you settled. He took the horse's reins, adding to Jack, Sarah's inside. She'll help the lady get comfortable. Jack guided Margaret toward the house, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Sarah's my housekeeper, he explained. Been with me since I bought this place 5 years ago. You'll like her. Sarah turned out to be a plump, maternal woman in her 50s who took one look at Margaret's bedraggled state and immediately sprang into action. Land sakes, child, you're soaked to the bone. Come with me right now. We need to get you warm and dry before you catch your death. She shot a pointed look at Jack. You too, Mr. Miller. I'll not have you tracking river mud all through my clean house. Jack smiled, and Margaret noticed how it transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him appear younger. Yes, madam, he said with mock solemnity. I know better than to argue with you. Sarah whisked Margaret away to a bedroom at the back of the house, where she helped her out of her ruined dress and into a hot bath that felt like heaven after her ordeal. Afterward, Sarah provided a simple but clean dress that, while a bit large, was infinitely better than her own sodden garments. It was my daughter's, Sarah explained as she helped Margaret button up the back. She's married now, living in Denver with her husband. I keep some of her things here for when she visits. Please thank her for me, Margaret said, grateful for the dry clothes. And thank you for your kindness. Sarah waved away her thanks. Any friend of Mr. Miller's is welcome here. She paused, studying Margaret with curious eyes. Though I must say, he's never brought a young lady home before. Not in all the years I've known him. Before Margaret could explain that she was hardly a friend, merely someone Jack had rescued, Sarah was ushering her to the kitchen, where a hearty stew was simmering on the stove. Jack was already seated at the table, freshly changed into dry clothes, a clean shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned, muscular forearms and dark trousers. His hair, still damp, curled slightly at the ends. He stood when Margaret entered, his eyes taking in her appearance with an appreciation that made her cheeks warm. "Feeling better?" he asked, pulling out a chair for her. "Much," she confirmed, taking the offered seat. "Though I'm afraid I've imposed terribly on your hospitality." Jack shook his head as he resumed his own place. "No imposition. I'm just glad I was there when you needed help." Sarah served them bowls of stew with thick slices of bread, then discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone in the warm, fragrant kitchen. "You mentioned Silver Creek," Jack said after they'd eaten in silence for a few minutes. "Is that your final destination, or were you just visiting your uncle?" Margaret set down her spoon. "I'm moving there permanently. My parents died last winter, influenza." She swallowed hard before continuing. "Uncle Henry is my only living relative. He offered me a place to stay and work in his store." "I'm sorry about your parents," Jack said softly. "Losing family is never easy." Something in his tone made Margaret look up sharply. There it was again, that sense that he was speaking from some deeper knowledge of her than a stranger should possess. "Have we met before, Mr. Miller?" she asked directly. Jack's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Something you said by the river. That you weren't letting go again, as if—" She hesitated. "As if you knew me." Jack was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Would you believe me if I told you I've dreamed about you, for years now?" Margaret stared at him, uncertain whether to be frightened or intrigued. "Dreamed about me? But that's not possible." "I know how it sounds," he said, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "But ever since I was 16, I've had these dreams. Of a woman with auburn hair caught in a flood. I watch her drown, again and again, and I can never reach her in time." His eyes, intense and earnest, met hers. "Until today, when I saw you in that river, it was like stepping into my dream, except this time I could save you." Margaret sat very still, processing his words. The rational part of her mind insisted this was madness, perhaps even a clever ruse by a man with less than honorable intentions. Yet there was something in Jack's expression, a raw honesty that was difficult to dismiss. "I understand if you don't believe me," he continued when she remained silent. "I hardly believe it myself. All I know is that when I saw you today, I knew I couldn't let you go, not again." "These dreams," Margaret said carefully, "what else did they show you? About me, I mean." Jack hesitated. "Not much, just the flood and—" He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "And what?" "And that you were important. That somehow our lives were meant to intersect." He gave a self-deprecating smile. "Sounds foolish when I say it aloud." Margaret found herself smiling back, despite her uncertainty. "Perhaps a little. But then again, you did save my life today. Maybe there is something to your dreams after all." Relief flickered across his face, followed by something else, a warmth that made Margaret's heart beat a little faster. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not thinking I'm completely mad." "The jury's still out on that," she replied with a touch of humor. "But I'm willing to reserve judgment until I know you better." "Fair enough," Jack agreed, his smile widening. "And speaking of knowing each other better, tell me about Silver Creek. Have you been there before?" The conversation flowed more easily after that, as Margaret told him about her childhood visits to her uncle's store, and Jack shared stories of his life as a rancher. By the time Sarah returned to clear their plates, Margaret was surprised to find how comfortable she felt in Jack's presence. despite the strange circumstances of their meeting. "It's getting late," Sarah announced. "Miss Thompson must be exhausted after her ordeal." Jack nodded, rising from his chair. "Of course. I'll ride into town tomorrow for supplies, and we can set out for Silver Creek the day after, if you feel strong enough." "That would be perfect," Margaret agreed, suddenly aware of how tired she truly was. The events of the day, the terror of nearly drowning, the shock of losing all her possessions, and the strange connection she seemed to share with Jack had taken their toll. Sarah showed her back to the bedroom, where fresh linens had been laid out on the bed. "Sleep well, dear," the older woman said kindly. "You're safe here." Alone in the quiet room, Margaret stood at the window, looking out at the moon-silvered landscape of Jack's ranch. How strange life was, she thought. This morning she had been a woman with a plan, traveling to start a new life with at least some sense of certainty about her future. Now, she had nothing but the borrowed clothes on her back and the kindness of a stranger who claimed to have dreamed of her for years. A stranger who had pulled her from a flooded river and vowed not to let her go again. As she slipped between the cool sheets, Margaret wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether Jack Miller's dreams held any clue to her future. Morning came with a gentle knock at her door. Margaret opened her eyes to sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating a room that looked far more charming in daylight than it had the previous evening. Simple but tasteful furnishings, clean pine floors covered partially by a hand-woven rug, and curtains that rustled in the breeze from the half-open window. "Miss Thompson," Sarah's voice called. "Breakfast is ready whenever you are." "Thank you," Margaret replied, sitting up. "I'll be right there." She dressed quickly in the borrowed dress, wishing she had a comb for her tangled hair. After doing her best with her fingers, she made her way to the kitchen, where the smell of coffee and frying bacon greeted her. Jack was nowhere to be seen, but Sarah bustled about, setting a plate of food on the table. "Good morning, dear. Sleep well." "Very well, thank you," Margaret said, taking a seat. "Where is Mr. Miller?" "Out checking the herd with Thomas. Spring calving season keeps them busy." Sarah poured her a cup of coffee. "He said to tell you he'd be back mid-morning to ride into town for supplies." Margaret nodded, feeling oddly disappointed that Jack wasn't there. "Is there anything I can help with while I'm waiting?" Sarah looked pleased at the offer. "Well, if you're feeling up to it, I could use some help with the washing. River might have taken your things, but it left plenty of mud on Mr. Miller's clothes." The morning passed quickly as Margaret worked alongside Sarah, grateful for the physical activity that kept her mind occupied. The older woman was a font of information about the area and, more interestingly, about Jack. "Been here 5 years," Sarah told her as they hung laundry on the line behind the house. "Came from back east with nothing but determination and some money he'd saved. Bought this land when no one else wanted it, too rocky, they said. But Mr. Miller, he worked day and night until he'd built something special." "He seems very capable," Margaret observed, pinning a shirt to the line. Sarah chuckled. "That he is. Stubborn as a mule, too, and private. Keeps to himself mostly, though he's well respected in these parts. Folks know they can count on him." "Has he always been alone?" Margaret asked, trying to sound casual. "I mean no family." Sarah's hand stilled momentarily. "Lost his parents young, no siblings that I know of, and as for a wife—" She shook her head. "Some of the local girls have tried to catch his eye, but Mr. Miller's never shown interest." She gave Margaret a shrewd look. "Until yesterday, that is." Before Margaret could respond to that pointed remark, the sound of hoofbeats announced Jack's return. She turned to see him riding toward the house, his tall figure silhouetted against the morning sky. "Right on time," Sarah said with satisfaction. "You best get ready if you're going into town with him." 20 minutes later, Margaret found herself riding beside Jack on a gentle mare he'd saddled for her. The day was gloriously clear, the spring air filled with the scent of wildflowers and grass. "How are you feeling today?" Jack asked, guiding his horse alongside hers. "Much better," she assured him. "Thank you again for your hospitality." He nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It's the least I could do." After a moment, he added, "I should apologize for what I told you last night about the dreams. It must have sounded strange." Margaret studied his profile, noting the tension in his jaw. "It did," she admitted, "but I've been thinking about it and I have a question." He turned to look at her, eyebrows raised. "Ask away." "If you've dreamed about me for years, why were you riding by that particular stretch of river yesterday? Of all the places you could have been, how did you happen to be exactly where I needed you?" Jack's expression grew thoughtful. "I wish I had a good answer for that. The truth is, I had a feeling stronger than usual that I needed to check the river. With the spring melt and recent rains, flooding was a concern anyway." He paused. "But yes, something drew me there specifically." "That seems more than coincidental," Margaret said quietly. "I've thought the same," Jack agreed, "though I'm not sure what it means." They rode in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The town of Cedar Ridge came into view, a typical frontier settlement with a main street lined with wooden buildings, horses hitched to posts, and people going about their daily business. Jack helped Margaret dismount in front of the general store. "I need to pick up supplies and check on a few things," he said. "Would you like to come with me, or would you prefer to look around on your own?" The idea of separating from Jack made Margaret unexpectedly anxious. "I'll come with you if you don't mind. Besides, I should see about replacing some of my lost things." A shadow crossed his face. "About that, I want you to get whatever you need. New clothes, personal items, anything. I'll take care of it." "I couldn't possibly," Margaret began, but Jack cut her off gently. "Please, let me do this. You can repay me when you're settled in Silver Creek, if it makes you feel better." After a moment's hesitation, Margaret nodded. "Thank you. That's very generous." Inside the store, Jack greeted the proprietor, a balding man with spectacles by name. "Morning, Willard. Need to stock up today." Willard nodded affably, then noticed Margaret. "Good day, madam. Don't believe I've had the pleasure." "This is Miss Thompson," Jack said. "She's staying at my ranch temporarily on her way to Silver Creek." Interest sparked in Willard's eyes, but Jack's tone discouraged further questions. The shopkeeper merely nodded and said, "Well, Miss Thompson, please let me know if there's anything special you need." While Jack discussed his order with Willard, Margaret browsed the store, selecting only the essentials: a simple dress, undergarments, a hairbrush, and a few toiletry items. She was acutely aware of Jack watching her from across the store, his gaze a tangible presence that both unsettled and thrilled her. Their next stop was the dressmaker's shop, where a friendly woman named Mrs. Abernathy took Margaret's measurements and promised to have a traveling dress ready by the following afternoon. "That's very quick," Margaret said, surprised. Mrs. Abernathy smiled. "When Jack Miller asks for something to be done promptly, folks around here try to oblige. He's done a lot for this town." Outside again, Jack suggested lunch at the local hotel before they completed their errands. The hotel's small dining room was nearly empty, allowing them to speak freely. "What did Mrs. Abernathy mean about you doing a lot for the town?" Margaret asked as they waited for their food. Jack looked uncomfortable with the question. "Nothing special, just neighborly things." "Like what?" he sighed, recognizing her persistence. "Last winter was hard. Blizzard cut the town off for nearly 2 weeks. I had beef stored and was able to get it to folks who were running low on food." He shrugged. "And a few years back, when the bank was threatening to foreclose on some of the smaller ranches, I helped negotiate better terms with the bank manager." That sounds more than neighborly, Margaret observed. It sounds heroic. Jack shifted in his seat. I'm no hero, just a man who believes in doing right by people. Their food arrived, hearty stew and fresh bread interrupting the conversation. As they ate, Margaret found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Jack's hands, strong, capable hands that had pulled her from the river, that now handled his cutlery with surprising grace. "Tell me about your parents," Jack said suddenly, "if you don't mind talking about them." The question caught Margaret off guard, but she found she didn't mind. "My father was a teacher. My mother kept house and helped at the school sometimes. They were good people, kind, hard-working." She smiled at a memory. "My father loved books. Our house was full of them. He used to say that a person who reads lives 1,000 lives. And your mother, she had the most beautiful singing voice. On summer evenings, she'd sit on our porch and sing, and neighbors would open their windows to listen." Margaret's throat tightened. "I miss them terribly." Jack reached across the table, his hand covering hers briefly. "I understand. I lost my parents when I was 14. Wagon accident." "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly. "It was a long time ago," Jack replied, though his eyes told a different story. "But it changes you, losing the people you love. Makes you realize how precious time is." His words hung between them, weighted with meaning that seemed to extend beyond their brief acquaintance. Margaret found herself wanting to know everything about this man, his hopes, his fears, the experiences that had shaped him. "What brought you west?" she asked. "Sarah mentioned you came from back east." A shadow passed over Jack's face. "I needed a fresh start. After my parents died, I lived with an uncle in Boston. He was not a kind man. As soon as I was old enough, I left. Worked my way across the country, taking whatever jobs I could find, factories, railroads, cattle drives." His mouth quirked in a half smile. "Saved every penny until I had enough to buy my own place." "You've accomplished a great deal in a short time," Margaret observed. Jack's eyes met hers. "What about you? What do you hope to find in Silver Creek?" Margaret considered the question. "Safety, I suppose, a place to belong." She hesitated. "After my parents died, staying in our hometown became unbearable. Too many memories, too many pitying looks." She didn't mention the unwanted advances from a wealthy neighbor who had seen her newfound vulnerability as an opportunity, one of the main reasons she'd accepted her uncle's invitation. "And your uncle, he's a good man. The best," Margaret assured him. "He visited every summer when I was growing up. Always brought the most interesting gifts from out west. He's the reason I wasn't afraid to make the journey." Jack nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. They finished their meal and spent the next couple of hours completing their errands, picking up supplies at the blacksmith's, ordering additional provisions at the general store, and stopping by the post office so Margaret could send a letter to her uncle explaining her delay. As they prepared to return to the ranch, a commotion near the bank caught their attention. A man burst through the doors, a gun in one hand and a sack in the other, followed by two similarly armed companions. "Bank robbery," Jack muttered, his hand automatically moving to the gun at his hip. "Stay here," he ordered Margaret, already moving toward the disturbance. But before Jack could intervene, the sheriff and his deputies appeared, guns drawn. The robbers, seeing themselves outnumbered, dropped their weapons. The confrontation ended almost as quickly as it had begun, with the robbers being led away in handcuffs. Jack returned to Margaret's side, his expression grim. "That could have gone much worse." "Does this happen often?" she asked, her heart still racing from the brief excitement. "Not anymore," Jack replied. "Sheriff Daniels has cleaned things up considerably since he took office, but it's still the frontier. Desperate men do desperate things." As they rode back to the ranch, Margaret found herself studying Jack with new eyes. There was a complexity to him that intrigued her, the capable rancher, the man respected by his community, the lonely boy who had lost his parents, and the dreamer who claimed some mysterious connection to her. "You're staring," Jack observed without looking at her. Margaret flushed. "I was just thinking. About how strange life is. 2 days ago, I didn't know you existed. Now." She trailed off, unsure how to articulate the odd sense of familiarity she felt with him. Jack glanced at her then, his blue eyes serious. Now I feel as if I've known you much longer," she admitted. A smile slowly spread across his face, transforming his features. "Good," he said simply, "because I feel the same way." They reached the ranch as the sun was beginning its descent, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Thomas came out to take their horses, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Everything quiet here?" Jack asked as he helped Margaret dismount. "Quiet as can be," Thomas confirmed. "Though Sarah's been cooking up a storm, says we're having a proper dinner tonight." Inside, delicious aromas filled the house. Sarah greeted them warmly, ushering them to wash up before dinner. Jack disappeared to put away their purchases, leaving Margaret alone with the housekeeper. "Had a good day in town?" Sarah asked as she stirred something on the stove. "Very pleasant," Margaret replied, moving to help set the table without being asked. "Everyone was so kind." Sarah nodded approvingly. "Folks around here think highly of Mr. Miller, and they're curious about any visitor he brings home, especially a pretty young lady." Margaret felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sure they'll be disappointed to learn I'm just passing through." Sarah gave her a knowing look, but said nothing more on the subject. Dinner was a jovial affair, with Thomas joining them at the table. The older man proved to be a wonderful storyteller, regaling them with tales of his adventures before he'd settled on Jack's ranch. "Been everywhere from Mexico to Canada," he told Margaret. "Seen things that would curl your hair, but never found a better place than right here." "Thomas was my first hire," Jack explained. "Found him trying to win a horse in a card game in Dodge City. He was so drunk he could barely see the cards. But I won that horse," Thomas pointed out with dignity. "Only because the other fellow passed out first," Jack retorted, grinning. Their easy camaraderie made Margaret smile. It was clear that Jack's ranch was more than just a workplace for these people. It was a home, a family of sorts. After dinner, Thomas excused himself to check on a pregnant mare, and Sarah retired to her room with some mending. Jack suggested that Margaret might enjoy sitting on the porch to watch the sunset. The evening was mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and sage. Jack brought out 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Margaret before taking a seat in the rocking chair beside her. "Tomorrow we'll head to Silver Creek," he said after a comfortable silence. "If that still suits you." Margaret nodded, surprised at the pang of regret she felt. "Yes, of course. My uncle will be worried if I delay much longer." Jack studied the darkening horizon. "It's about a day's ride. We'll need to start early." "Will Thomas manage things here while you're gone?" "He's more than capable," Jack assured her. "I'm often away for a day or two on ranch business." Another silence fell between them, this one charged with unspoken thoughts. "Jack," Margaret said finally, using his first name deliberately. "May I ask you something personal?" He turned to look at her, his face partly in shadow. "Of course. These dreams you had about a woman drowning, were they the reason you never married?" "Because you were waiting for her for me." Jack's hands tightened around his coffee cup. For a long moment he didn't answer. When he did, his voice was low and intense. "I never thought of it that way before, but yes, I suppose they were. I've never been able to form a lasting attachment to any woman. Something always held me back." He set his cup down on the small table between them. Until I pulled you from that river, I didn't understand what it was. Margaret's heart quickened. And now I know, he said simply. It was always you. The directness of his statement took her breath away. You can't possibly know that. We've only just met. Haven't we? Jack challenged gently. When I look at you, Margaret, I feel like I'm remembering something I've always known, not discovering something new. That's... She searched for the right word. That's unsettling. A soft laugh escaped him. Believe me, I know. If someone had told me this story a week ago, I'd have thought they were mad. He leaned forward, his eyes finding hers in the gathering dusk. But here you are, and here I am. And something brought us together. Margaret couldn't deny the strange connection she felt to him. From the moment he'd pulled her from the river, there had been a sense of rightness about his presence in her life. I don't know what to make of any of this, she confessed. But I do know that I feel safe with you, comfortable in a way I've never felt with a stranger before. Then perhaps we're not strangers after all, Jack suggested. Perhaps we're just catching up to what fate already knew. The idea was both frightening and exhilarating. Margaret had always considered herself a practical person, not given to flights of fancy or mystical thinking. Yet here she was, seriously considering the possibility that she and Jack were somehow destined to meet. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When you take me to Silver Creek," Jack's face grew serious. "That depends on you. I won't hold you to anything. You have a life waiting for you there, plans you made before I entered the picture. And if I want to change those plans," his eyes never left hers, "then I would be the happiest man in Colorado territory." Margaret's heart raced. This was madness, considering altering her entire future for a man she'd known for barely 2 days. And yet, "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to understand what I'm feeling." Jack nodded, a small smile playing at his lips. "Time is something I can give you. I've waited years for you already. A few more days or weeks won't matter." As they sat in companionable silence watching the stars emerge, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her. Whatever strange forces had brought her and Jack together, she was grateful for them. The river that had nearly claimed her life had also delivered her into the arms of a man who looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. Morning arrived with a crispness in the air that promised a beautiful day for traveling. Margaret rose early, dressing in the new clothes they'd purchased in town, a practical traveling outfit of a simple blue skirt and white blouse. Sarah had insisted on washing and mending Margaret's boots, which had survived the flood relatively intact. When she entered the kitchen, Jack was already there, speaking quietly with Thomas. Both men looked up as she appeared, and Margaret felt a flutter in her stomach at the way Jack's eyes brightened. "Good morning," she said, suddenly shy. "Morning," Jack replied, his voice warm. "Sleep well, very well, thank you." Sarah bustled in from the pantry carrying a basket. "I've packed food for your journey," she announced. "Enough for both of you and then some." "That's very thoughtful," Margaret said, touched by the woman's kindness. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with Thomas excusing himself early to tend to the animals. Sarah hovered, refilling coffee cups and offering more food than any of them could possibly eat. "I'll be stopping by Mrs. Abernathy's to pick up your dress on our way out of town," Jack told Margaret as they finished eating. "Is there anything else you need before we leave?" Margaret shook her head. "I think we've thought of everything." An hour later, they were ready to depart. Thomas had saddled both horses and loaded their provisions. Sarah stood on the porch, watching them with an expression that seemed both pleased and melancholy. "You take care of yourself, Miss Thompson," she called as Margaret mounted her horse. "And don't be a stranger to this ranch." "I won't," Margaret promised, surprised at how much she meant it. In just 2 days, she had come to feel at home here. Jack swung into his saddle with practiced ease. "We should reach Cedar Ridge by midday," he told Margaret. "We'll pick up your dress and have lunch before continuing to Silver Creek." They set off at a comfortable pace, the morning sun warming their backs. The landscape was spectacular, rolling hills giving way to more dramatic terrain as they rode, with mountains looming majestically in the distance. "Your land is beautiful," Margaret observed as they followed a well-worn trail. "It is," Jack agreed, his gaze sweeping the horizon with obvious pride. "But it's more than just the land, it's what we've built here. A place where people can live honestly, work hard, and be rewarded for it." "You sound like a man who loves his home." Jack nodded. "I do. When I first came west, I was running away from my past. But now I stay because I can't imagine being anywhere else." He glanced at her. "What about you? Do you think you could be happy in this part of the country?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications. Margaret considered it seriously. "I think I could," she said finally. "It's different from Virginia, certainly. Wilder, less constrained by convention, but there's a freedom in that, isn't there?" "There is," Jack confirmed. "Out here, a person is judged more by what they do than who their parents were or how much money they have." "That's appealing," Margaret admitted. "In my hometown, everyone knew everyone else's business, their history, their mistakes, their family scandals." She hadn't realized how suffocating that had been until she'd left. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret found herself studying Jack's profile against the blue sky, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hat shadowed his eyes, the confident set of his shoulders. How strange it was to feel so drawn to someone she barely knew. Or did she know him? There were moments when she felt a flash of recognition, as if she were remembering Jack rather than getting to know him. "What are you thinking?" Jack asked, catching her gaze. Margaret considered deflecting the question but decided on honesty instead. "I was thinking about fate. About whether some things are meant to be." A slow smile spread across Jack's face. "And what conclusion did you reach?" "I'm still deciding," she replied, returning his smile. "But I'm more open to the possibility than I was 2 days ago." Jack's expression grew serious. "Margaret, I want you to know something. Whatever you decide when we reach Silver Creek, whether you stay with your uncle as planned or—" He hesitated. "Or consider other options, I'll respect your choice. I won't pressure you." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you. That means a great deal to me." As they approached Cedar Ridge, the trail widened into a proper road. They passed farms and smaller ranches, occasionally exchanging greetings with other travelers. The town was busier than it had been the previous day, with wagons lining the main street and people going about their business. Jack and Margaret stopped first at the dressmaker's shop, where Mrs. Abernathy had Margaret's traveling dress ready as promised. "It looks lovely," Margaret said sincerely, admiring the practical but attractive garment. "Thank you for completing it so quickly." Mrs. Abernathy beamed. "My pleasure, dear. It's not often I get to sew for someone with your figure." She cast an approving glance at Jack, who was waiting patiently by the door. "You two make a handsome couple." Before Margaret could correct her assumption, Jack stepped forward to pay for the dress. The proprietress wrapped it carefully in brown paper and string. "Will we see you at the Founders' Day dance next month, Mr. Miller?" Mrs. Abernathy asked as she handed the package to Margaret. "It would be nice to see you actually enjoying yourself for once, instead of just helping with the arrangements." Jack smiled politely. "We'll see, Mrs. Abernathy. Depends on the ranch." Outside, Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Founders' Day dance." Jack looked slightly embarrassed. "Annual town celebration. I usually help with setting up the hall, bringing in beef for the feast, that sort of thing." But you don't dance, Margaret teased gently. I haven't had reason to, he replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Until now, perhaps. They left their horses at the livery stable while they had lunch at the hotel, then collected them and continued their journey east toward Silver Creek. The afternoon sun was warm on their backs as they rode, the landscape gradually changing as they left the foothills and entered more open country. We'll reach Silver Creek by nightfall, Jack said as they stopped to rest the horses by a small stream. Your uncle will be relieved to see you safe. Margaret nodded, a strange reluctance settling over her at the thought of their journey ending. These past days with Jack had been unexpected but wonderful, a bubble outside of normal time where anything seemed possible. Jack, she said suddenly, what if I told you I'd like to stay at your ranch a little longer? Before deciding about Silver Creek, he turned to her, surprise and hope warring in his expression. I'd say that would make me very happy, but what about your uncle? I could send word explaining the situation. Ask for a little more time, she hesitated. That is, if you're certain I wouldn't be imposing. Jack stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. Margaret, having you at my ranch would never be an imposition. It would be. He seemed to search for the right word. A gift. The sincerity in his voice made her heart race. She was about to respond when the sound of approaching horses caught their attention. Jack instinctively moved in front of Margaret, his hand dropping to his gun. 3 riders appeared around a bend in the trail, slowing as they spotted Jack and Margaret. Margaret felt Jack tense beside her. Miller, the lead rider acknowledged, his tone neutral but not friendly. He was a hard-looking man in his 40s with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. Rollins, Jack replied evenly. Didn't expect to see you this far from your usual haunts. The man called Rollins shrugged, his eyes drifting to Margaret with a look that made her uncomfortable. Business takes me all over. Who's your companion, Miss Thompson? Jack said, not elaborating. We're on our way to Silver Creek. Rollins studied Margaret for a moment longer than was polite, then returned his attention to Jack. Silver Creek. Give my regards to Sheriff Kelly when you get there. There was something in his tone that suggested a private joke. Jack merely nodded, his posture still tense. Well, don't let us keep you, Rollins said, gesturing to his companions. They rode past with Rollins tipping his hat to Margaret as he passed. Madam, pleasure meeting you. When they were out of earshot, Margaret turned to Jack. Who was that? Jack's expression was grim. Vince Rollins runs a ranch about 30 miles north of mine, though ranch might be too respectable a word for it. He shook his head. He's been suspected of rustling, among other things, but nothing's ever been proven. You don't like him, Margaret observed. No one who knows him does, Jack replied. He's dangerous, Margaret. If you see him again, keep your distance. The encounter had cast a shadow over their journey, and they mounted up in silence. As they rode, Jack seemed preoccupied, scanning the horizon frequently as if expecting trouble. Do you think they'll cause problems? Margaret asked after a while. Jack shook his head. Not likely. Rollins is smarter than that. He knows I'm friendly with Sheriff Daniels in Cedar Ridge. He glanced at her. But I don't like that he was headed in the direction of my ranch. Could he be planning something? Possibly. Or it could be nothing. Jack forced a smile. Let's not let him ruin our day. Tell me more about what you'd like to do if you stay at the ranch a while longer. Margaret allowed the change of subject, sensing Jack's desire to recapture their earlier mood. Well, I'd like to learn more about ranching. I've always lived in town, so my experience with animals is limited. I could teach you to ride properly, Jack offered. And Sarah would probably appreciate help with the garden. She's been wanting to expand it. They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing possibilities, the encounter with Rollins gradually fading from their minds as they planned. By the time the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in spectacular hues of orange and pink, they had crested a small rise and could see the lights of Silver Creek in the distance. "There it is," Jack said, reining in his horse. "Your destination." Margaret gazed at the town spread out before them, larger than Cedar Ridge, with more substantial buildings and a general air of prosperity. Somewhere down there was her uncle's store, the new life she had planned before the flood, before Jack. "It looks lovely," she said, but her voice lacked enthusiasm, Jack noticed. "Having second thoughts, maybe," she admitted. "Everything's happened so fast. 2 days ago I was certain about my path. Now—" She looked at him, taking in the strong lines of his face, the warmth in his eyes. "Now I'm not sure of anything except that I don't want to say goodbye to you yet." A slow smile spread across Jack's face, transforming it. "Then don't," he said simply. "Come back to the ranch with me. Give us time to understand what's happening between us." Margaret hesitated, torn between practicality and the powerful pull she felt toward this man. "My uncle will be worried. We'll go into town, send him a message explaining the situation, and get rooms at the hotel for tonight," Jack suggested. "Then tomorrow we can head back to the ranch if that's what you decide you want." It was a reasonable compromise, and Margaret found herself nodding. "All right, but I'd like to meet with my uncle in person, explain things face to face." "Of course," Jack agreed. "That's only right." They rode into Silver Creek as the last light was fading from the sky. The main street was well lit with lamps, businesses still open for evening trade. They passed a saloon from which piano music spilled, a hotel with a small restaurant attached, and various shops including, Margaret noted with a flutter of nervousness, Thompson's Mercantile. "That's my uncle's store," she told Jack, pointing to the 2-story building with large display windows. A lamp still burned inside, suggesting her uncle was working late. Jack followed her gaze. "Would you like to stop now, or get settled at the hotel first?" Margaret took a deep breath. "Now, I think, best to explain things straight away." They dismounted in front of the Mercantile, tying their horses to the hitching post. Jack placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's arm before she entered. "I'll be right beside you," he promised. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. The store was well stocked and neatly arranged, with everything from food staples to tools to clothing. Behind the counter stood a balding man in his 50s, peering at a ledger through spectacles. He looked up at the sound of the bell, his expression changing from polite interest to shock as he recognized his visitor. "Margaret," he exclaimed, coming around the counter. "My God, girl, I was beginning to fear the worst. You were due days ago." "Uncle Henry," Margaret said, stepping forward to embrace him. "I'm so sorry to have worried you." Henry Thompson returned her embrace warmly before holding her at arm's length to inspect her. "You're safe, that's what matters. But what happened? And who is this gentleman?" Jack stepped forward, removing his hat. "Jackson Miller, sir. I'm a rancher from near Cedar Ridge." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed Jack. "And how do you come to be escorting my niece?" Margaret quickly explained about the flood, her near drowning, and Jack's timely rescue. As she spoke, her uncle's expression softened, and by the time she finished, he was looking at Jack with undisguised gratitude. "It seems I owe you a great debt, Mr. Miller," Henry said, extending his hand. "You saved my only family." Jack shook the offered hand firmly. "Anyone would have done the same, sir." "Perhaps, but it was you who was there when needed." Henry turned back to Margaret. "But my dear, this still doesn't explain why you're only arriving now, days later." Margaret exchanged a glance with Jack, gathering her courage. "Uncle Henry, I've come to ask your understanding. Mr. Miller has kindly offered to let me stay at his ranch for a time while I consider my options." Her uncle's bushy eyebrows rose. Options? I thought your plans were settled. You were to live here and help with the store. I know, Margaret said quickly, and I'm still considering that, but recent events have made me realize I might want something different. She hesitated, then added with complete honesty, I've formed a connection with Mr. Miller that I'd like to explore further. Henry studied her face for a long moment, then looked at Jack. Whatever he saw in their expression seemed to satisfy him, for he nodded slowly. I see, he said, his voice gentler than before. Well, my dear, you're a grown woman capable of making your own decisions. If this is what you want, I won't stand in your way. He fixed Jack with a stern look. Though I would like to know more about the man who's captured my niece's interest so quickly. Jack met his gaze steadily. I understand, sir. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Henry nodded, apparently satisfied with this response. Good. Now it's getting late and you both look tired from your journey. Where are you staying tonight? We thought we'd get rooms at the hotel, Margaret explained. Nonsense, Henry declared. I have plenty of room upstairs. Margaret, you can have the guest room and Mr. Miller can take the sofa in my study. Jack began to protest, but Henry waved him off. I insist. It's the least I can do for the man who saved my niece's life. Besides, this way we can continue our conversation over breakfast. The matter settled, Henry closed up the store while Margaret and Jack retrieved their belongings from their horses. The living quarters above the mercantile were spacious and comfortable, reflecting Henry's success as a businessman. He showed Margaret to a pleasant bedroom with floral wallpaper and a large window overlooking the main street, then led Jack to his book-lined study, where a sofa had been made up with sheets and blankets. Not as comfortable as a proper bed, Henry apologized, but better than most hotel accommodations in these parts. It's perfect, Jack assured him. Thank you for your hospitality. Left alone, Jack sat on the edge of the sofa, removing his boots and contemplating the day's events. Everything was moving faster than he'd anticipated, but he couldn't deny the rightness he felt whenever he looked at Margaret. The connection between them was undeniable, inexplicable though it might be. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He stood to open it, finding Margaret in the hallway, her hair loose around her shoulders. I wanted to thank you, she said quietly, mindful of her uncle in the next room. For everything. For saving me, for bringing me here, for understanding my confusion. Jack resisted the urge to reach for her hand, aware of the impropriety of their situation. You don't need to thank me, Margaret. If anything, I should thank you. Her eyebrows rose. For what? For not thinking me completely mad when I told you about my dreams. For considering the possibility that there might be something special between us. He smiled softly, for giving us time to discover what that might be. Margaret returned his smile, her eyes luminous in the lamplight. Good night, Jack. Sleep well. Good night, Margaret. As she turned to go, he added softly, I meant what I said by the river. I'm not letting go again. She paused, looking back at him with an expression that made his heart race. Good, she whispered, because I don't want you to. Morning brought the smell of coffee and bacon, drawing Jack from a deep sleep. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he found Henry Thompson already up and cooking. Good morning, Mr. Miller, Henry greeted him. Coffee's ready if you'd like some. Thank you, Jack said, pouring himself a cup. And please call me Jack, Henry nodded, turning bacon in a skillet. Jack it is. Margaret's not up yet. Girl always did enjoy her sleep. Jack smiled at this glimpse into Margaret's habits. Can I help with breakfast? You can set the table, Henry suggested, gesturing to a cabinet. Plates are in there, cutlery in the drawer below. They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes, the awkwardness Jack had expected notably absent. Finally, Henry spoke, his tone conversational but his words pointed. "So, Jack, tell me about this ranch of yours." Jack recognized the question for what it was, an assessment of his ability to provide for Margaret should things progress between them. He described his property, the size of his herd, the improvements he'd made over the years, and his plans for expansion. Henry listened attentively, occasionally asking shrewd questions that revealed his business acumen. By the time Margaret appeared, yawning and apologizing for oversleeping, the two men had reached a level of mutual respect. Breakfast was a pleasant affair, with Henry regaling them with stories of Silver Creek's early days. Margaret seemed relaxed, laughing at her uncle's tales and contributing memories from her childhood visits. "Your father always said you'd end up out west someday," Henry told Margaret, his expression softening at the mention of his late brother. "He saw the way your eyes lit up whenever I talked about life out here." "Did he?" Margaret asked, surprised. "He never said anything to me about it." Henry chuckled. "Of course not. He wanted you to stay close to home, but he knew deep down that you had the frontier spirit." After breakfast, Henry insisted on giving Jack a tour of his store, proudly pointing out innovations he'd implemented to better serve his customers. Jack was genuinely impressed by the older man's business sense, and said so, earning a pleased smile from both Henry and Margaret. "Now," Henry said as they completed the tour, "I understand you two are planning to return to Cedar Ridge today." Margaret looked at Jack, then back to her uncle. "Yes, if that's still all right with you." Henry waved a hand dismissively. "As I said last night, you're a grown woman, Margaret. You don't need my permission." His expression grew more serious. "But you do have my blessing if that matters to you. Mr. Miller Jack seems a decent sort, and God knows I can't argue with a man who saved your life." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She embraced her uncle tightly. "Thank you, Uncle Henry. I promise I'll write often and I'll visit as soon as I've figured things out." Henry patted her back affectionately. "Take your time, my dear. The store will still be here if you decide that's what you want." He looked at Jack over Margaret's shoulder. "And so will I, keeping an eye on things." Jack nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. "I'll look after her, sir. You have my word." They left Silver Creek mid-morning with promises to return soon for a proper visit. As they rode away from the town, Margaret seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Your uncle is a good man," Jack observed. "He is," Margaret agreed. "I've always admired him. His acceptance means a great deal to me." They rode at a leisurely pace, taking time to enjoy the journey and each other's company. The day was perfect for traveling, clear skies, moderate temperature, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and sage. "Tell me more about your dreams," Margaret said after they had been riding for a while. "The ones about me." Jack glanced at her, surprised by the request. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. When they started, how often they came, what exactly you saw." Jack considered his words carefully. "They began when I was 16, just after I left my uncle's house in Boston. The first one was so vivid it woke me from a sound sleep. I saw a woman you struggling in a flooded river. I was on the bank trying to reach you, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get to you in time." He shook his head at the memory. "I watched you go under and then I woke up." "That sounds terrible," Margaret said softly. "It was, especially because it felt so real. Not like a normal dream at all, but like I was actually there, witnessing something happening." He paused. "The dreams came regularly after that, always the same basic scenario but with small differences. Sometimes I'd get closer to you before you went under. Sometimes I'd actually touch your hand before losing you. But the outcome was always the same until 2 days ago, when I finally found you in real life." Margaret was silent for a moment, processing his words. Did you ever think you were? I don't know, seeing the future somehow. I considered it, Jack admitted, but it seemed so fantastic, and besides, why would I dream about a stranger? It made no sense. Yet here we are, Margaret observed. Here we are, Jack agreed, smiling at her, defying all logic and reason. They stopped for lunch by a small stream, spreading out the food Sarah had packed for them on a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree. As they ate, they continued to share stories of their lives, filling in the gaps in their knowledge of each other. "What would you have done if you hadn't found me?" Margaret asked suddenly. "If you'd lived your whole life having those dreams but never meeting me?" Jack considered the question seriously. "I don't know," he said finally. "I think I would have always felt that something was missing, that there was someone out there I was supposed to find." He looked at her directly. "I'm grateful I don't have to know the answer to that question." The intensity in his gaze made Margaret's heart race. They were sitting close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, the way the sun brought out hints of gold in his brown hair. Without conscious thought, she leaned toward him slightly. Jack's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle but certain. "Margaret," he said softly, her name a question and an answer all at once. She closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was both tentative and profound. Jack responded with a restraint that spoke of respect, but when Margaret's hand came up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart beneath her palm, his kiss deepened. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing more rapidly than normal. Jack rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I've wanted to do that since I pulled you from the river," he confessed. Margaret smiled, a sense of rightness settling over her. "I'm glad you waited. It would have been rather forward otherwise." Jack laughed, the sound rich and warm. "I suppose it would have." He kissed her once more, briefly but tenderly, before rising to his feet and offering her his hand. "We should get back on the trail if we want to reach the ranch before dark." They packed up their picnic and continued their journey, riding closer together than before. The afternoon passed in pleasant conversation and comfortable silences, the landscape rolling by in a panorama of beauty. As the sun began its descent, they crested a familiar rise, and Jack's ranch came into view in the valley below. The sight filled Margaret with an unexpected sense of homecoming. "Welcome back," Jack said, noting her expression. "It feels right," she admitted, "being here with you." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "It does, doesn't it?" They rode down into the valley, the ranch buildings growing larger as they approached. Thomas spotted them first, waving from the corral where he was working with a young horse. Sarah appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her face lighting up when she recognized Margaret riding beside Jack. "You came back," she exclaimed as they dismounted in the yard. "I was hoping you might." Margaret smiled, touched by the warm welcome. "I couldn't stay away," she said, realizing as she spoke that it was true. Something about this place, these people, and especially Jack had drawn her back as surely as if invisible strings connected them. That evening, after a hearty dinner during which Thomas and Sarah discreetly refrained from asking too many questions about their change of plans, Jack suggested a walk. The night was clear, stars spangling the sky above them as they strolled toward the stream that ran through the property. "Are you happy with your decision to come back?" Jack asked as they stood on a small footbridge, watching the moonlight play on the water below. "Very happy," Margaret assured him, "though I'm not entirely sure what happens next." Jack turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "What would you like to happen next?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "I'd like to stay here, at least for a while, get to know you better, learn about ranch life." She smiled up at him, See if what's between us is as special as it feels." "I'd like that too," Jack said, his voice low and warm. "And I promise to be patient to give you all the time you need." "What if I don't need much time?" Margaret asked boldly, surprising herself with her directness. "What if I already know what I want?" Jack's eyes darkened. "And what is it you want, Margaret Thompson?" She stepped closer to him, her heart pounding but her mind clear. "You, Jack Miller, I want you." His arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him. "Are you sure? We've known each other such a short time." "I'm sure," she said firmly. "I can't explain it any more than you can explain your dreams. All I know is that when I'm with you, I feel as if I've found something I didn't even know I was looking for." Jack's smile was radiant in the moonlight. "I feel the same way." He hesitated, then added, "I love you, Margaret. I think I've loved you since before I met you." The words should have frightened her with their intensity, their improbability. Instead, they filled her with a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. "Against all reason and logic, I love you." His kiss was tender at first, then deepening with a passion that left her breathless. When they finally parted, both were trembling slightly. "Marry me," Jack said suddenly. "Not tomorrow or next week, when you're ready, when you're certain." Margaret laughed, the sound bubbling up from a well of happiness she hadn't known existed within her. "Yes," she said simply, "when I'm ready, when we're both ready." They walked back to the house hand in hand, the future stretching before them like the star-filled sky above, vast, mysterious, and filled with infinite possibilities. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity and discovery. True to her word, Margaret threw herself into learning about ranch life. She rose early each morning, eager to help with chores and observe the daily operations of Jack's domain. Sarah taught her to cook on a wood stove, to preserve fruits and vegetables from the garden, and to manage the various household tasks that kept the ranch running smoothly. Thomas showed her how to care for horses, explaining each piece of tack and its purpose with the patience of a born teacher. And Jack taught her to ride properly, to understand the rhythms of the land, to recognize the signs of changing weather and seasons. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, talking for hours about everything and nothing, the connection between them deepening with each passing day. Word spread quickly about Jack Miller's houseguest. Neighbors from nearby ranches found excuses to visit, their curiosity thinly veiled behind offers of assistance or invitations to social gatherings. Margaret met them all with grace and warmth, winning over even the most skeptical with her genuine interest in their lives and her willingness to learn. 3 weeks after their return from Silver Creek, Jack surprised Margaret with an invitation to the Founders' Day dance in Cedar Ridge. "You don't have to accept," he assured her as they rode together, checking fence lines on the northern boundary of his property. "I know these country dances can be rather rustic compared to what you might be used to back east." Margaret laughed. "Jack Miller, if you think I'm going to pass up an opportunity to see you in your Sunday best, leading me around a dance floor, you don't know me very well at all." His answering smile was worth any amount of potential social awkwardness. "In that case, Miss Thompson, I'll be honored to escort you." The day of the dance arrived with perfect weather, warm but not oppressively hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of late spring blossoms. Margaret spent the morning helping Sarah with household chores, then retired to her room in the afternoon to prepare. She had only the 2 dresses they'd purchased in Cedar Ridge, but Mrs. Abernathy's traveling dress was quite suitable for a country dance. Sarah helped her arrange her hair in a simple but elegant style, pinning it up with combs borrowed from the housekeeper's own collection. "You look beautiful, dear," Sarah said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Mr. Miller won't be able to take his eyes off you." Margaret blushed, smoothing the skirt of her dress. "Thank you, Sarah, for everything." The older woman patted her cheek affectionately. "You've brought life back to this house, child, and more importantly, you've brought happiness to a good man who's been alone too long." When Margaret descended to the main room, Jack was waiting by the fireplace. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and the expression that crossed his face made her heart skip a beat. "Margaret," he said, his voice low with admiration, "you look absolutely beautiful." She took in his appearance: the crisp white shirt, the dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, his hair neatly combed and his face freshly shaved. "You're quite handsome yourself, Mr. Miller." Thomas had prepared the buggy, and they set off for Cedar Ridge with the afternoon sun still high in the sky. The drive was pleasant, the road smooth, and Jack's company as engaging as ever. "I should warn you," he said as they approached the town, "you'll be the center of attention tonight." New faces are always a source of interest in these parts, especially when they arrive on the arm of a confirmed bachelor like myself. Margaret smiled, secretly pleased at the thought of being publicly acknowledged as Jack's chosen companion. "I think I can handle a little curiosity." The town hall had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the large open space. Tables lined the walls, laden with food brought by the townsfolk. At one end of the hall, a small group of musicians was setting up: two fiddlers, a guitarist, and a man with a concertina. Their arrival caused exactly the stir Jack had predicted. Conversations paused, heads turned, and within moments they were surrounded by curious townsfolk eager to meet the woman who had captured Jack Miller's interest. Mrs. Abernathy appeared at Margaret's elbow, beaming with approval. "Miss Thompson, how lovely to see you again. And wearing my dress. I see it suits you perfectly." Introductions blurred together as Margaret met what seemed like half the population of Cedar Ridge in quick succession. Jack remained steadfastly by her side, his hand occasionally coming to rest at the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. Sheriff Daniels approached them, tipping his hat respectfully. "Miss Thompson, good to see you recovered from your ordeal," he nodded to Jack. "Miller, Sheriff," Jack acknowledged. "Fine turnout tonight." "Best we've had in years," Daniels agreed. "Word is you're staying at Miller's ranch," he added to Margaret, his tone casual but his eyes shrewd. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "That's right, Mr. Miller has been kind enough to offer me hospitality while I decide on my future plans." The sheriff's mouth twitched in what might have been a suppressed smile. "Well, it's a good ranch, solid operation." He glanced at Jack. "And Miller here is one of the most respected men in these parts, though he'd never admit it himself." Before Jack could respond, the musicians struck up the first dance, a lively reel that had couples quickly forming sets across the floor. "Would you care to dance, Miss Thompson?" Jack asked formally, extending his hand. Margaret placed her hand in his. "I'd be delighted, Mr. Miller." Jack proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her through the steps with confidence and grace. Margaret, who had learned the formal dances of Virginia society, adapted quickly to the more exuberant style of the frontier celebration. As they moved through the figures of the dance, Margaret caught glimpses of the other townsfolk watching them with varying degrees of interest and approval. Mrs. Abernathy was nodding happily to another older woman. Sheriff Daniels stood by the punch bowl, a knowing expression on his face. Even Willard from the general store was smiling benevolently in their direction. "I think we're causing quite a sensation," Margaret murmured to Jack as they came together in the dance. Jack's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Did I mention that I haven't attended one of these dances in years, and certainly never with a partner?" No wonder they're staring, Margaret laughed. They're probably checking for signs of an imposter. The evening continued with more dancing, plentiful food, and conversation with the various residents of Cedar Ridge. Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the simple, heartfelt celebration. The people were forthright and friendly, accepting her readily as Jack's companion. As the night wore on, the music slowed, and Jack led Margaret onto the floor for a waltz. Unlike the earlier dances with their prescribed figures and limited contact, the waltz allowed him to hold her close, one hand at her waist, the other clasping hers. "Happy?" he asked softly as they moved together in perfect harmony. "Completely," she replied, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Jack's eyes never left hers as they danced, the rest of the room fading into insignificance around them. When the music ended, he didn't immediately release her, and Margaret found herself hoping he never would. "I have something for you," he said unexpectedly, guiding her toward a quieter corner of the hall. "I was going to wait, but, well, tonight seems right." From his pocket he produced a small box, simple but elegant. Margaret's heart began to race as he opened it to reveal a ring, a delicate gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "It was my mother's," Jack explained, his voice low with emotion. "The only thing of hers I managed to keep when I left my uncle's house." Margaret stared at the ring, then at Jack's face, her eyes filling with tears. "Jack, I meant what I said by the stream," he continued. "This is for when you're ready, when you're certain. I don't want to rush you, Margaret. But I want you to know that my heart is yours, completely and irrevocably." Margaret took a shaky breath, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling between them. 6 weeks ago, she had been a different person with different plans and expectations. Now, standing before this man who had saved her life in more ways than one, she knew with absolute certainty what her answer would be. "I'm ready now," she said simply. "I'm certain now." Jack's expression transformed, hope and joy illuminating his features. "You're sure? You don't need more time?" Margaret shook her head, smiling through her tears. "Time won't make me any more certain than I already am. I love you, Jack Miller. I want to be your wife." With hands that trembled slightly, Jack took the ring from its box and slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "I love you, Margaret Thompson," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I ever thought it was possible to love another person." Their kiss was brief but profound, mindful of their public setting but unable to completely contain the joy that overflowed between them. When they turned back to the room, they found that their moment had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Abernathy was openly weeping into her handkerchief, while Sheriff Daniels raised his punch cup in a silent toast. Across the room, faces smiled in approval and celebration. Word of their engagement spread through the dance with the speed of a prairie fire. For the rest of the evening, they were surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations and advice. By the time they left for the drive back to the ranch, Margaret's cheeks ached from smiling, and her heart felt too full for her chest to contain. Under a canopy of stars, with Jack's arm around her shoulders and the gentle rhythm of the horses' hooves beneath them, Margaret reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led her here. A flooded river that should have ended her life had instead delivered her to a new beginning, one filled with love, purpose, and a sense of belonging she had never thought to find. "What are you thinking?" Jack asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Margaret leaned into him, savoring his warmth and strength. "I'm thinking that sometimes the worst moment of your life can lead to the best." Jack's arm tightened around her. "When I pulled you from that river and said I wouldn't let go again, I had no idea how true those words would become." "I'm glad you didn't let go," Margaret said softly. I'm glad you held on until I could hold on too. They returned to the ranch late, the house dark except for a single lamp left burning in the window. As Jack helped Margaret down from the buggy, their eyes met in the moonlight, and the promise of their future together shimmered between them like a tangible thing. "Welcome home, Margaret," Jack said, his voice a caress in the night. "Home," she repeated, tasting the word and finding it sweet. "Yes, I believe it is." 3 months later, on a perfect September day, Margaret Thompson became Margaret Miller in a ceremony held on the ranch she now called home. Henry Thompson traveled from Silver Creek to give his niece away, his eyes suspiciously bright as he placed her hand in Jack's. The entire population of Cedar Ridge seemed to have turned out for the occasion, along with ranchers and farmers from miles around. Even Sheriff Kelly from Silver Creek had made the journey, bringing greetings from those who couldn't attend. Sarah had outdone herself with the preparations, transforming the ranch yard into a wonderland of flowers and ribbons. Thomas, normally so stoic, looked positively dapper in his Sunday best, standing proudly as Jack's best man. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Jack bent to kiss his bride, a cheer went up that could probably be heard all the way to Denver. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night with music, dancing, and enough food to feed an army. As the last guests departed, Jack led Margaret to the porch of their home, and they stood together in the moonlight, his arms around her waist, her head resting against his chest. "Happy, Mrs. Miller?" he asked, his voice warm against her ear. Margaret turned in his embrace, reaching up to touch his beloved face. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible. You know," Jack said thoughtfully, "I haven't had that dream since the day I pulled you from the river. Not once." "Perhaps you didn't need it anymore," Margaret suggested. "Once you found me in real life." Jack nodded, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Or perhaps it was never about warning me of danger at all. Maybe it was simply leading me to you, across time and distance, to the moment when I could save you, when we could save each other." Margaret considered this, finding poetry in the idea. "I like that. That somewhere, somehow, we were always meant to find each other." "Against all odds," Jack added, bending to kiss her with infinite tenderness. "Against all odds," Margaret agreed when they parted, her heart so full of love it seemed impossible to contain it. As they stood together under the vast Colorado sky, the future stretched before them like an unwritten story, one they would write together, day by day, year by year. There would be challenges, no doubt, and sorrows as well as joys. But Margaret knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever came, they would face it together, bound by a connection that defied explanation but demanded acknowledgement. Jack had pulled her from a flooded river and vowed not to let go again. And in doing so, he had not only saved her life, but given her a love story more beautiful than any she could have imagined, a love born of dreams and destiny, made real by courage and choice. 5 years later, Jack and Margaret stood on the porch of their expanded ranch house, watching their twin daughters play in the yard under Sarah's watchful eye. At 3 years old, Emma and Lily were bundles of energy and curiosity, with their father's blue eyes and their mother's auburn hair. "They're growing so fast," Margaret observed, leaning against Jack's solid presence beside her. "Too fast," he agreed, his arm secure around her waist. "Seems like yesterday they were barely walking." The ranch had prospered in the years since their marriage. Jack's careful management and Margaret's keen business sense, inherited from both her father and uncle, had allowed them to expand their operations and improve their property. The main house now boasted additional rooms for their growing family, and a new barn stood where the old one had been. Thomas remained their foreman, though he had more help these days, 3 young cowboys who handled much of the physical labor. Sarah continued to run the household with loving efficiency, doting on the twins and making no secret of her hope for more children to spoil. "Uncle Henry's letter arrived today," Margaret said, gesturing to the envelope on the small table beside them. "He's coming for a visit next month. Says he wants to see the girls before they are all grown up." Jack smiled. "Good. It's been too long since his last visit." Henry Thompson had sold his store in Silver Creek 2 years earlier, ostensibly to retire but in reality to travel extensively throughout the West. He made a point of visiting the ranch at least twice a year, bringing exotic gifts for his great-nieces and endless stories of his adventures. "I was thinking," Margaret said, her tone casual but her eyes intent on Jack's face, "that we might have some special news to share with him when he arrives." Jack's eyebrows rose. "Special news?" Margaret took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "I saw Dr. Wilson yesterday. He confirms what I've suspected for a few weeks now." Joy bloomed across Jack's face, his eyes lighting with wonder. "Another baby, are you sure?" "Quite sure," Margaret confirmed, laughing as Jack swept her into his arms, lifting her feet off the ground in his enthusiasm. "Careful," she protested, though she wasn't truly concerned. Jack had never been anything but gentle with her. He set her down carefully, his hands lingering at her waist. "How do you feel? Are you well? Should you be resting?" Margaret's heart warmed at his concern. "I'm perfectly fine, doctor. Wilson says everything appears normal. The baby should arrive in early spring." "Another spring baby," Jack mused, glancing at their daughters playing in the yard. The twins had been born in April, almost exactly 4 years after he had pulled Margaret from the flooded river. "It seems appropriate somehow," Margaret agreed, following his gaze. "New beginnings." Jack turned back to her, his expression growing serious. "When I think of how close I came to losing you that day, how my whole life, everything we've built together, everything we are to each other, nearly ended before it began." Margaret placed her fingers against his lips, stopping his words. "But it didn't end. You found me. You saved me." "We saved each other," Jack corrected, echoing the words they had spoken on their wedding night. "Every day we save each other. And now we have even more to live for," Margaret said, her hand returning to her still flat stomach. "Another little piece of both of us." Jack covered her hand with his own, his touch reverent. "I love you, Margaret Miller, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." "And I love you," she replied, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "Always and forever." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jack and Margaret called their daughters to come inside for supper. Hand in hand, they walked into the home they had built together, a home filled with love, laughter, and the precious gift of family. Years ago, a raging river had nearly separated them forever. But fate, or destiny, or perhaps simply the unbreakable connection between two souls meant to find each other, had intervened. Jack had pulled Margaret from those floodwaters and vowed never to let go again. It was a promise he had kept, through joy and sorrow, through challenge and triumph. And in the keeping of that promise, they had found not just love but a life richer and more meaningful than either could have imagined possible. As night fell over the Colorado Valley they called home, stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, constant, eternal reminders that some connections transcend understanding, but are no less real for their mystery. And in the warmth of their home, surrounded by the family they had created together, Jack and Margaret Miller continued writing their love story, a story that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances, but would endure for all their days.